The challenge was blunt, delivered as a statement rather than a question. "He's only an actor," the man said, a fighter used to testing his skill against anyone who crossed his path. 7 seconds later, the room understood that words had misrepresented reality. Bruce Lee remained calm, unhurried, hands empty, his expression unreadable. And yet the outcome was immediate, undeniable. The fighter's assumptions shattered before he could comprehend what had occurred. Witnesses would recall one fact above all: skill does not announce itself, and authority does not wait for permission. The gym smelled of sweat, leather, and the faint tang of metal from worn weights and training equipment. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, flickering occasionally, casting a diffuse glow over the mats and punching bags. The walls were lined with mirrors, some cracked, others scuffed, reflecting decades of effort, discipline, and minor victories. It was an ordinary training space, functional rather than polished, yet it carried the quiet authority of repeated routine and focus. Students moved through warm-ups and light sparring, their bodies attuned to movement and rhythm. Their interactions were purposeful but restrained. There was an implicit understanding that skill could be observed and measured, even without spoken instructions. Trainers leaned against the edges of the mats, arms crossed, eyes tracking motion with precise attention. The gym was alive in its subtle ways, a small, controlled ecosystem of observation, effort, and hierarchy. Bruce Lee entered without announcement. He carried nothing in his hands, wore no uniform, and moved without urgency. Yet immediately, the energy of the space shifted. The students sensed him before they noticed him fully. A quiet authority settled over the room, so subtle that it could have been mistaken for an ordinary presence. But those who knew him, or who had trained with him before, recognized it instantly. He did not speak, did not command, did not even offer a nod of acknowledgement. His mere presence redefined the parameters of observation. He leaned briefly against a wall near the edge of the mat, arms relaxed, feet planted evenly. His gaze swept the room slowly, registering posture, alignment, and intent. There was no hint of performance, no attempt to dominate through movement. He simply absorbed the space, letting the patterns of interaction among students and trainers unfold under his quiet scrutiny. A few fighters paused in their drills, unconsciously adjusting their stances, recalibrating their awareness. Even the trainers straightened subtly, aware that the room's balance had shifted. The hum of fluorescent lights and the soft slap of feet on mats became secondary to the gravitational pull of observation and restraint emanating from Bruce Lee. This was a gym where physicality was expected, where skill was measured in speed, strength, and endurance. But Bruce Lee's presence introduced an unspoken question: mastery could exist without exertion, authority without aggression. The atmosphere was no longer just about routine practice. It was about understanding the limits of perception and the subtle assertion of control. As he moved slowly to adjust his position near the edge of the mat, students and trainers alike sensed that something beyond ordinary training was about to occur. There was no spectacle. There was no demand for attention. Only quiet observation, and in that stillness the gym prepared itself for a moment it would not soon forget. The stage was set. The fighters who entered later would bring confidence, expectation, and reputation. Bruce Lee needed none of these. His authority existed independently, embedded in his calm, measured presence. The gym had become more than a training space. It had become a testing ground, without announcement, without words, and without visible preparation. And in that calm, measured silence, everyone present knew the encounter to come would define not only skill, but the subtle, enduring nature of mastery itself. The door to the gym swung open abruptly, the sound cutting through the low hum of fluorescent lights and the muted slap of feet against mats. A man entered with the assured stride of someone accustomed to dominance. His body was solid, trained, conditioned. Every movement carried the expectation that he commanded the room merely by stepping inside. He was a professional MMA fighter, recognized in local circuits for both his victories and his confidence. His reputation preceded him. He scanned the gym instantly, eyes sharp and direct, settling on Bruce Lee almost immediately. There was a faint smirk, a subtle challenge embedded in the tilt of his head. "He's only an actor," he said aloud, loud enough for those near the edge of the mat to hear. The statement was less about conversation and more about establishing psychological ground. The fighter expected acknowledgement, expected tension, expected a reaction. Bruce Lee remained still. He did not respond verbally, did not adjust his posture in any show of readiness, and did not meet the smirk with one of his own. He observed. His gaze was steady, unflinching, calm. There was no provocation, no performance, no suggestion that he had been caught off guard. His authority was implicit, embedded in presence rather than speech. The room, once quietly tense with routine activity, seemed to pause. Observers leaned forward subtly. Students froze mid-step, trainers straightened, and even the fighter's confidence, built over years of experience, began to meet the invisible weight of scrutiny. Bruce Lee's calm presence created a gravitational pull that none of the gym's occupants could ignore. The room no longer measured strength in sweat or exertion. It measured perception, control, and readiness. The fighter took a step closer, shifting his weight deliberately, hands relaxed but ready. He had entered expecting resistance, a test of reflexes, of strength, perhaps of aggression. What he encountered instead was a quiet inevitability. Bruce Lee did not step forward. He did not signal engagement. He merely existed in space, and in that existence the nature of the challenge became clear. Students whispered in low tones, not to provoke but to acknowledge what they were seeing, the presence of mastery without performance. The fighter's posture remained aggressive in appearance, but subtly, almost imperceptibly, he adjusted. His eyes flicked toward Bruce Lee's hands, noting the lack of weapon, the calm alignment of feet, the controlled balance of his stance. There was no underestimation in Bruce Lee's gaze, only awareness. The gym had become charged, but not with noise or spectacle. It was attention measured in milliseconds, micro-adjustments, and unspoken understanding. The unspoken question hung in the air: what would happen when the fighter tested the actor? The answer, the observers sensed, would arrive swiftly, quietly, and without ceremony. Bruce Lee's presence communicated the rules before a single motion could occur. Mastery did not need to announce itself. Dominance did not require confrontation. At that moment, the gym understood that the forthcoming encounter would not follow expected patterns. The MMA fighter had entered seeking a challenge. The room instead was about to witness inevitability. And in that calm, controlled space, all who were present recognized that the next few seconds would define perception, skill, and authority in a manner far removed from ordinary competition. The tension in the gym was no longer carried by words or movement. It hung silently in the space between Bruce Lee and the fighter. No one spoke, no one prompted the challenge. It had already been posed simply by presence. The MMA fighter had entered expecting a physical test, a confrontation of reflex and force. What he faced instead was a stillness that measured him more accurately than any strike or grapple could. Bruce Lee's gaze remained steady, scanning only to understand, not to intimidate. His posture was relaxed yet precise, feet aligned evenly, weight balanced, shoulders unhurried. Every micro-adjustment was subtle, deliberate, and unnoticeable to anyone who did not know where to look. There was no motion to anticipate, no telegraphing of intent. Yet the fighter sensed the question. A challenge of perception, timing, and awareness, unspoken but immediate. Observers, standing quietly along the edges of the mat, felt the shift instantly. The usual gym sounds, the scrape of shoes on mats, the faint thud of gloves on bags, the buzz of fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Attention compressed into the space between the two men. Each subtle movement, each breath, each slight shift of weight carried meaning. Those watching understood, without instruction, that the encounter would resolve itself not through extended engagement, but through the clarity of instinct and skill. The fighter adjusted his stance, testing boundaries, trying to establish psychological dominance. His eyes searched for weakness, for signs of hesitation, for anything that could be exploited. Bruce Lee gave nothing. He did not flinch, blink excessively, or react. His awareness was complete, yet invisible. There was no challenge, no confrontation, only the quiet assertion of mastery through calm observation. Time seemed to stretch in those seconds. The unspoken question, the moment of assessment, was palpable. How would the fighter act? How would Bruce Lee respond, if at all? The answer, every observer sensed, would be instantaneous, minimal, and decisive. It would not require force, noise, or spectacle. The room, the students, and the trainers collectively leaned into the space, as if inhaling in unison, waiting for clarity to emerge. The fighter's body subtly tensed, prepared to react to motion that never came. Bruce Lee did not advance, did not retreat. His hands remained relaxed at his sides, his breathing even, his expression neutral. The space itself seemed to contract around him, a quiet gravitational force that rendered the fighter's expectation of confrontation unnecessary. Then, in the compression of those 7 seconds, the unspoken question resolved itself. Without warning, without flourish, the subtle economy of Bruce Lee's presence and his precise, controlled movement determined the outcome. The room did not need to see a struggle. The result was apparent in the immediate recalibration of posture, in the almost imperceptible shift in balance, and in the recognition of authority that could not be disputed. Observers would later describe it in fragments: a tilt of the shoulder, a microstep, a hand adjusting slightly on the mat. They could not reconstruct the exact sequence, nor did they try. The moment was understood as a complete, self-contained demonstration, clarity and control without spectacle. And in that silence the encounter had begun and concluded before the gym had time to comprehend it fully. Mastery, it became evident, did not need to shout to be recognized. It existed quietly, decisively, and undeniably in the stillness of presence. The encounter began not with motion, but with presence. Bruce Lee remained centered, composed, his weight balanced evenly between both feet. The MMA fighter, expecting a prolonged struggle or a contest of visible skill, stepped forward instinctively. Yet the moment was brief, its outcome already written in the subtle economy of Lee's movements. For 7 seconds, the space between them became a measure of control, awareness, and timing. Each fraction of a second carried significance. The fighter extended slightly, testing reflex and reaction, perhaps anticipating resistance or a defensive maneuver. Bruce Lee responded, but not with force.
His adjustments were minute, shifts in weight, micro-alignments of wrist and shoulder, a barely perceptible change in stance. To the untrained eye, nothing appeared to happen. Yet everything was resolved in those imperceptible movements.
Observers noticed only the changes in posture, the minute recalibrations of balance, and the fleeting expressions that crossed the fighter's face.
There was no struggle, no outward exertion, no dramatic grappling.
The authority of Bruce Lee communicated itself entirely through presence and precision. In that moment, his mastery transformed the expected narrative. The contest was decided not through strength or spectacle, but through efficiency and perception. The fighter's stance faltered subtly. His confidence, built over years of training and victories, met a force he could not quantify. He had entered expecting resistance, anticipating physical testing. What he encountered instead was inevitability. Bruce Lee's stillness and precise timing left no room for debate, no opportunity for aggression to alter the outcome. The crowd remained silent, yet acutely aware. Students and trainers later recalled noticing the shift even before they could understand it. It was in the fighter's eyes, the slight tension in his shoulders, and the recognition that his expectation had been quietly subverted. 7 seconds, brief, almost imperceptible, had communicated more than any prolonged display could have. The encounter concluded without flourish. Bruce Lee remained upright, relaxed, and controlled. His breathing was even, his hands at rest, as if no confrontation had occurred. The fighter, for his part, adjusted subtly, absorbing the reality of what had transpired. There was no shame, no dramatics, only acknowledgement of a mastery that required neither display nor repetition. Observers would later recount the incident not by cataloging motion, But by describing the certainty in that brief window, 7 seconds had resolved a challenge that most would have expected to take minutes or more. The decisive clarity of Bruce Lee's skill lay not in what was done, but in what had been silently demonstrated, the capacity to dominate perception, timing, and space without struggle. By the time the 7th second passed, the unspoken lesson had been delivered. Authority did not need to be declared. It existed, complete, undeniable, and quietly irreversible. And in the silence that followed, everyone present understood that the rules of engagement had been rewritten, not with spectacle, but with precision, calm, and control. The moment of recognition was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profound. The MMA fighter, whose confidence had been unshakable upon entering, now paused, adjusting his stance with a slight shift of weight. His eyes, once sharp and challenging, flicked briefly toward Bruce Lee's hands and posture, registering an awareness that had not existed before. The realization did not arrive as shock or anger. It came as a quiet, internal acknowledgement that the expectations he had carried into the gym were no longer relevant. Observers noted the change in micro-expressions. A tightening of the jaw, a brief exhale, a small relaxation of the shoulders. These were the indicators that the fighter was recalibrating his understanding of the encounter. The physicality he relied upon, the years of training and experience, had been met with something outside conventional measure, a mastery that required no struggle, no demonstration of force, no spectacle. The silence of the room amplified the psychological shift. There were no cheers, no gasps, no outward acknowledgement. Instead, the space seemed to hold its breath, each witness quietly absorbing the recalibration of dominance that had just occurred. It was as if the unspoken lesson had traveled faster than any words could, embedding itself in posture, expression, and attention. For the fighter, this recognition was immediate and personal. He did not speak, did not protest, did not attempt to reclaim authority through aggression or argument. His composure remained intact, but subtly, his stance reflected the new understanding, a concession without need for announcement. Those trained to read human behavior noticed the micro-shifts that marked the moment, small gestures that signaled internal acknowledgement of the superior control Bruce Lee had exercised. Observers who later recounted the incident emphasized the quiet impact more than the encounter itself. They remembered the stillness, the recalibration of expectation, the weight of authority conveyed without words or extended action. The psychological lesson was clear. Skill could assert dominance through precision and presence alone, requiring neither struggle nor dramatic performance. The room held this awareness collectively. Students and trainers, who had witnessed countless demonstrations and challenges before, understood that what had occurred was rare, a convergence of perception, timing, and control that resolved the challenge in an almost imperceptible moment. The lesson was quiet, but its effect was undeniable. Even as the fighter began to adjust, returning to a neutral stance, the imprint of Bruce Lee's authority lingered. It did not fade with time or movement. In that quiet recalibration, the encounter transcended the immediate physical space, becoming a psychological benchmark for all present. They saw, in those seconds, that mastery could be silent, decisive, and irreversible. By the time the room resumed its usual rhythm, the acknowledgement had already taken hold. The MMA fighter, the students, and even the instructors carried the weight of understanding, a recognition that skill need not be boisterous to be absolute. And in that stillness, the psychological shift, the internal recognition of authority, stood as the most enduring outcome of the encounter. The tension that had filled the gym began to dissipate slowly, almost imperceptibly. No one spoke immediately, and the air remained thick with the quiet acknowledgement of what had just occurred. Students resumed their drills, though more cautiously, eyes occasionally flicking toward Bruce Lee and the fighter as if measuring the residue of authority left in their wake. The gym's rhythm returned, but it was subtly altered, less noisy, more deliberate, more observant. Bruce Lee did not linger. He moved with quiet purpose toward the edge of the mat, gathering his belongings with the same calm precision that had characterized the encounter. There were no gestures of triumph, no glance backward for affirmation. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, and unhurried. His authority required no validation. The demonstration had already spoken for itself. The MMA fighter remained for a moment, adjusting his stance, smoothing his uniform, and realigning himself with a posture less aggressive, more reflective. There was no outward display of frustration, no attempt to reclaim dominance, no dramatics. His acknowledgement was internal, subtle, and private. In the eyes of those watching, the shift in his demeanor was unmistakable, a recalibration of expectation and respect, quietly registered and silently carried forward. Observers began to murmur, not in excitement, but in measured conversation. They recounted details to each other, the subtle tilt of a shoulder, the almost imperceptible adjustments in stance, the way presence alone had dictated the outcome. No one needed to embellish. The clarity of the demonstration transcended commentary. Students and trainers slowly returned to their routines. Mats were straightened, weights replaced, gloves readjusted, yet the energy of the space had changed. There was a new understanding embedded in the movement and posture of everyone present, a tacit recognition that mastery could exist beyond force and spectacle. Even ordinary exercises were now performed with heightened attention to precision, timing, and subtlety. Bruce Lee exited the gym with measured steps, calm and composed, leaving behind no trace of theatrics, only the weight of quiet authority. The fighter followed shortly after, composed yet internally transformed, carrying with him the lesson of the encounter without the need for words or explanation. By the time the door closed behind them, the gym was technically empty of its central figures, but their presence lingered. Students, trainers, and observers were left with a memory of efficiency, perception, and authority that would inform their practice long after the physical space had returned to normal. The encounter, though brief, had left an indelible imprint, one that required no applause to validate, no repetition to affirm, and no spectacle to prove. In the calm that followed, the gym itself seemed altered, not structurally, not in any material way, but in atmosphere. The subtle imprint of mastery and presence remained, a quiet lesson woven into the routine of practice, silently instructing those who continued their training long after the participants had departed. In the days and months following the encounter, the incident circulated quietly among those who had witnessed it. It was never retold as a story of spectacle, nor as a dramatic victory. Instead, fragments were passed along in hushed tones, each observer recalling their own perception of the moment, the micro-adjustments, the stillness, the inevitability that had left no room for debate. No one could fully reconstruct what had happened. The demonstration was precise, controlled, and almost imperceptible, leaving only impressions. Students recounted the way the fighter's posture had shifted in subtle acknowledgement. Trainers spoke of Bruce Lee's presence, how it had silently dominated the room without movement or force. Each retelling emphasized different details: the tilt of a shoulder, the alignment of the feet, the brief focus of an eye. No account fully captured the encounter, yet all agreed on the outcome. Clarity and authority had been established in mere seconds. The MMA fighter himself rarely discussed the event, and when he did, it was with restraint. He did not dwell on defeat, nor did he seek to embellish. He acknowledged the skill he had encountered and moved forward, leaving the story intact yet enigmatic. The lesson was absorbed, not articulated, a recognition that mastery could operate quietly, decisively, and without fanfare. Observers found themselves reflecting not only on what had happened, but on what it revealed about perception and skill. The encounter became a subtle benchmark, a demonstration that efficiency, timing, and awareness could surpass brute force. Students began to incorporate the lesson into their own practice, not through imitation of technique, but through observation of presence and attention to minute detail. Over time, the story evolved into legend, not because of the drama of the encounter, but because of its ineffable clarity. It was cited in private conversations, referenced quietly in training, and remembered by those who had been present as a moment of authority exercised without declaration. The 7 seconds, though brief, became a measure of what skill could achieve when mastery was silent, deliberate, and complete. Even years later, the incident persisted in recollection. Witnesses remembered the calm inevitability, the psychological shift in the fighter, and the quiet command of space that Bruce Lee had exerted. The lesson endured not in spectacle, but in understanding, a quiet, persistent example of the authority that presence and precision could wield. In this way, the encounter lived on, not as a story of confrontation, but as a subtle, enduring testament to the power of control, awareness, and the unspoken assertion of mastery. Years passed, and the story of the 7-second encounter settled quietly into the lore of those who had witnessed it. It was rarely discussed in public forums or recorded formally. Instead, it lingered in memory, in the subtle retellings among martial artists, trainers, and students. Each retelling was measured, deliberate, emphasizing calm authority over spectacle. The details differed slightly with each account. The angle of a wrist, the tilt of a shoulder, the faint shift of weight, but the essence remained. Mastery had spoken without words, and the lesson was timeless. The gym itself changed over the years. Mats were replaced, walls repainted, equipment updated, yet the atmosphere seemed infused with an invisible residue of the event. New students entering the space often remarked on an unspoken quality, a quiet expectation that practice carried more weight than technique alone. The memory of that encounter became part of the dojo's character, shaping how people moved, observed, and measured skill. It was not a legend of victory, but a legend of presence. Bruce Lee's reputation among those who had witnessed the moment grew, not because of fame or theatrics, but because of the precision and authority he had demonstrated. He became an example not of force, but of efficiency, awareness, and timing. Observers reflected on the encounter as a model of mastery. One could assert control without aggression, establish authority without spectacle, and leave lasting impact through measured action. The MMA fighter, once confident and vocal, carried the memory privately. He never disparaged the experience nor sought to diminish it. Instead, he acknowledged silently the insight it had given him. In later years, he would occasionally reference it to others, not as a story of defeat, but as a subtle lesson in perception and timing, a reminder that skill and authority could exist beyond physical prowess. Students and trainers who had been present internalized the lesson differently. Some focused on presence, the way Bruce Lee's calm observation altered the space before a single motion was made. Others emphasized timing, the way 7 seconds had sufficed to resolve the encounter entirely. The story became a teaching tool, not of technique, but of understanding, an embodiment of quiet mastery that could inform decades of training. Even decades later, the incident was invoked quietly in discussions of authority and skill. It was remembered not for the participants, but for the principle it demonstrated. Mastery exists beyond repetition, beyond strength, and beyond noise. It resides in perception, restraint, and precision. Those who carried the story forward did so with reverence, respecting its subtlety, and often without ever repeating it fully. In the end, the encounter became more than a memory. It became a lens through which to view practice, discipline, and skill. The lesson endured silently, shaping understanding long after the participants had departed. And in that quiet, reflective space, Bruce Lee's mastery remained present, a testament to what can be accomplished when authority is exercised with clarity, control, and unwavering presence.